Good afternoon. Welcome to the GCSP. My name is Marc Finaud. I'm a senior advisor here, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you on this public discussion from nuclear disarmament to nuclear energy implications for human security. And this is an event that we organize jointly with the Livelihood Award Foundation. I'm sure most of you have heard about this award, which is sometimes called the Alternative Nobel Prize. And we have on the podium two of these laureates who accepted to come and talk about their experience and share their expertise on these questions. And I'm pleased to welcome Ms Angie Zelter, who is a campaigner for the abolition of nuclear weapons and was a laureate of the award in 2001. She comes from the United Kingdom. And Mr Mycle Schneider, who is an independent expert on nuclear energy policy and the author of the World Nuclear Industry Status Report and member of the International Panel on Fissile Material. And he received the award in 1997. And yes, but it's still relevant. And as a contributor and discussant on these issues, also we have a world expert from Switzerland. He didn't get any awards from this foundation, but he's recognized as the former Deputy Director General and Head of Safeguards at the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, and he's the honorary president of the Swiss Nuclear Forum. And Bruno Pellaud is Swiss and still very active. So we thank them, and we'd like to also give the floor to Dr. Julianne Cronin, who's a board member of the foundation, and she will explain in a few words why we organize this event at this stage, at this moment.
Yeah, thank you very much for the welcome, and we're really excited to have the first joint event together with the GCSP. You might not know that the Right Livelihood Award Foundation is a neighbor in this building. So our foundation is located in Sweden, in Geneva, in Stockholm, but since last year we also have an office here, and we call it the Embassy of the Virtual Republic of Laureates. We have about 166 laureates around the world in 69 countries, and many of them working in human rights issues, many of them working with organizations here in Geneva. So we are basically their place whenever they come through Geneva to support their work. Let me explain in a few sentences the history of the foundation and the purposes and what we do. The Right Livelihood Award Foundation was founded about 35 years ago by Jakob von Uexküll, a Swedish journalist, who went to the Nobel Committee and said, look, that the problems on this planet have become so complex, I think we need 2 more awards for education, for human rights, for environmental issues, and it's somehow not covered by the singular dimensions of the Nobel Prizes. And the Nobel Committee said, Mr. von Uexküll, this is a great idea, but unfortunately Alfred Nobel has set the range of prizes, so sorry, we cannot even take the money, we cannot change this. So, but he got so much support, he decided to start it on his own, and he started to give the award to people who come up with practical solutions to the most urgent problems on this planet, who address the root causes. We believe that many people have great ideas how to change the world. On the other hand, we know that people are doing tremendous things and helping on the humanitarian side, helping in academics, but somehow they don't challenge and don't change the rules of the game. So at the foundation, we look for people in this intersection, challenging the rules of the game, addressing root causes, and really getting traction. It's an open process. Contrary to other awards, everybody can nominate anyone on this planet. We do a very thorough research process, going on the ground, going to parts of the world where your State Department usually doesn't want you to travel, to really see in the environment whether those solutions are sustainable. We do 4 things with the award. We honor the laureates, the work they have done, many of them for a very long time. with all of their energy, all of their resources. We support them, and unfortunately that also means we protect them. About a third of our laureates are under risk, be it personal risks, be it the risk not to talk about what they do. We had laureates being killed or members of laureate organizations being killed. There's a whole range of measures we do to protect them, and that is also located in our Geneva office. So research and protection is located in the Geneva office, where we work together with the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteurs, and fortunately can help in one or the other situation. I don't know whether you followed this year's laureates, one of them being Cumhuriyet, the opposition newspaper in Turkey. They're trying to crack down the paper and arrested the editor-in-chief this morning and 15 journalists. So those are things we protest, we work on, we work with the embassies. The next thing is we educate. We have about 8 campuses around the world, right? Livelihood campuses, where we bring the laureates together with academia. Geneva is not yet, I have to say, a campus, but this is what we do. We bring laureates here, we bring them to the Graduate Institute, we bring them to the institutions here at the Maison de la Paix, and we're very happy to be at the Maison de la Paix as part of the program and the intention. And as I said, we inform about the laureates. We always tell them getting the award is just the beginning, it's not the end of it. It's just the beginning, and they join a family which is very active and very mutually supportive. The reason why so many of them are here is that we have the first regional conference of European laureates for 3 days at Chateau Bossé. We have a very fruitful cooperation with the Church of Sweden, which is funding an annual retreat of local or regional laureate meetings. Tremendously important, especially for those who are working under tremendous personal risks, Latin America being the most dangerous area for human rights activists in those times. So that is the reason we have 18 laureates together discussing internally, but today is our day when we go out and have a series of public events. And this is, as I said, the first one with the GCSP, and we were very, very happy to have the panel, to have you as a host. And I just wanted to make sure that you have some idea where we're coming from, because we are very well aware and very appreciative that for many of you, it's the first time you're in touch with our award. If you have never heard about it, maybe you've heard about the Alternative Nobel, because that's the title we usually go by. Thank you very much for coming, and back to you.
Thanks very much, Julianne, for this very useful introduction. And now we jump into the topic of the day. And I will just ask one question to each panelist, and then we'll have some hopefully lively discussion back and forth among them and with the audience. So let's start with Angie, if you allow. You're an activist. You've been campaigning for nuclear disarmament in general, but most specifically in your own country against the renewal of the Trident program more recently. So what is the main lesson that you learned from your experience? Because you can, as we can see, the campaign is not successful. Nuclear weapons are being maintained and developed. At the same time, there are some successes, as we can discuss later, the vote of the UN resolution on the treaty to ban nuclear weapons. So overall, how would you assess your rate of success?
Well, the main problem has been that governments and the people in power have tried to keep secrets from the ordinary people and talk about security in a way that ordinary people don't understand. So our main success over the years is to actually bring to light a lot of what's been going on. So, and also then to protest about what's going on and to try to make changes. So some of our successes, for instance, at Greenham Common, was to get thousands of women to surround the bases there when they were bringing in cruise missiles and stopped that process. Another success has been with local people in Lakenheath, in an area in eastern England, where we had nuclear weapons from the US forces, free-fall bombs. There were so many incursions by local people saying we do not want nuclear weapons here, especially from the US. It became too expensive for them to protect these nuclear weapons, and they were taken out. So there have been some successes, we mustn't forget that. The other thing is that ordinary people, when they're awakened to the problems, start looking and trying to find out what's going on. So, for instance, in the UK for maybe 30 years now, citizens groups have been trying to follow the convoys, the nuclear convoys, that are on the roads going from Burfield, where the nuclear weapons are put together, and then taken up to Fissile in Scotland, where they're put on the submarines, to find out that they're actually going through towns and villages and accidents are happening. Now, without those citizens groups getting involved, we wouldn't even have known about that. And recently I was in France, and the French peace movement don't know where their nuclear convoys are going. This is really important because especially now, with Scotland being so anti-nuclear weapons, this issue of nuclear convoys being on the roads is something that the politicians are taking up and people are taking up and saying, look, we don't want nuclear weapons, and we certainly don't want these warheads being transported on our roads where there's accidents that are happening, and they note those accidents. The other thing was that because of the monthly vigils and local people around Aldermaston and Burfield, where the nuclear warheads are made, because of their continual looking into the bases, they discovered a long time before the government told us that modernization processes were going on, which was against the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and raised that issues. So ordinary people who are concerned about these things have an amazing role to play. One of the other things that I want to tell you about is because we rely on the law being used, and police are meant to be enforcing the rule of law. We're very concerned that Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Act, which are part of British law, are not being kept. That actually the nuclear weapons that Britain has could never be used in accordance with international law. Now, in the 80s, we tried to bring this through the courts, and that was not possible. But now it was stopped at a very low level because there's much more interest in international law now, and international lawyers are talking to each other. It's, in a way, a no-brainer. It's obvious to most international lawyers that the nuclear arsenals that are in existence today could never be used in accordance with international law. So we're trying again as a citizens group to bring a public interest case against Trident, and to try to get the courts to look at the actual facts and the law rather than saying this is a Crown prerogative, you can't look at the defence forces, we can't look at this in the courts. So that's another important issue. And so basically, ordinary people are just saying, look, nuclear weapons do not help us. They are not a part of our security. They are actually a danger, and these are the reasons why, and they protest. In short.
Thank you very much. I keep in mind the points you made about the important role of civil society, and as we have seen in this whole debate, both on nuclear weapons and on nuclear energy, sometimes this is where the initiatives comes from, to put more controls on what governments are doing. Now, to nuclear energy precisely, and you may wonder why, and is it justified to put those two issues together? What's the connection between, on the one hand, nuclear weapons and nuclear energy? Well, as we know, historically, no nuclear weapons state could produce their nuclear weapons without having first developed civilian nuclear energy. So there is this historical connection, and as you can see now, all the nuclear weapon states have a civilian nuclear industry. And also, we can see countries that produce fissile material that can be used for nuclear weapons that are not nuclear weapon states, like Japan, with huge stockpiles of highly enriched uranium and plutonium. And that's why they are under strict control from the IAEA, as Bruno Pellaud knows very well. So, precisely on the issue of nuclear energy and nuclear security, what is your point of view, Michael, on where we stand? We have seen, of course, nuclear accidents in Chernobyl and Fukushima. Some countries are phasing out nuclear energy, some are developing it. There have been the nuclear security summits. There's fear about nuclear terrorism. Where do you think that this is leading us? Is the current development of the energy mix, in particular towards renewables, likely to overcome the need for nuclear energy, or will this be some parallel tracks or parallel evolutions?
Whoa, you're opening up like 5 big issues at the same time. Let me maybe start by one angle, which is maybe clarifying the implications between, so-called civil nuclear facilities and security issues, and security in the large sense. And that's nuclear terrorism. It's something that has been around as a concept, if I may say so, for decades, but has changed dramatically with not only the current world situation and the number of conflicts, but the type of organizations that exist today and the means that these organizations have today. And what I must say is, like, I'm stunned about the incapacity of governments to take the lessons from, especially from 9/11. Because if you look back, I mean, that's 15 years ago. In the nuclear industry's governance, nothing has changed. In fact, facilities which I consider like the most problematic from that point of view, like France developing a full-scale plutonium economy, which means, for example, shipping every week on average weapons usable material in the form of separated, unirradiated plutonium over a 1,000-kilometer long distance by truck over public roads. This has been ongoing prior to 9/11, and it's going on after 9/11. In fact, there wasn't even any interruption. And I thought this was always an amazing kind of fact, because you think this is a total security nightmare, right? I mean, I always wonder how these people that are responsible for physical protection of these shipments, how they sleep at night. Because these trucks are attackable by countless means. And as an organization like Greenpeace has shown, you can drive behind the truck, besides the truck, and in front of the truck, right? I mean, they've filmed that, they've demonstrated that over and over again. Nothing changed, nothing. To me, that's a real problem. Because from a nuclear terrorism risk assessment point of view, you have to look at 2 things that are very different. One is vulnerabilities. So what are easy targets? That's one area. And obviously a moving truck is a very vulnerable target. The other area, which is totally different, is to look at what the radioactive inventories are. So where are the largest inventories that could be, in case of attack, could be released? Actually, just like in an accidental release, except it's on purpose, right? And you realize that this is actually, these are the same facilities. La Hague concentrates, probably by far, the site that concentrates the largest radioactive inventory. And if you think that in the case of Fukushima, the Prime Minister Naoto Kan at the time, had a scenario on the desk, which was the potential necessary evacuation of over 10 million people in the case of a spent fuel pool fire of Unit 4 in Fukushima. And you might recall that this is the unit that was not in operation. And the problem was that if they lose the water in the pool, they could get a fire in the pool, and the radioactivity would basically be released in dispersible form, and with the consequences you could imagine. Now, at the time with Fukushima 4, if I remember correctly, it was something like 135 tons of fuel or so that were in the pool. La Hague, the spent fuel reprocessing plant, has currently about 10,000 tons of spent fuel. So, from a security point of view, these have like steel shield, like a garage-type roofs, right? And 9/11 has shown that people actually target places. Now, these facilities have not been built to standards like to protect, for example, against drones, right? Drones didn't exist at the time when these facilities were conceived. So I think there's an increasing discrepancy between risk assessment and political and technical attitude towards these risks. And I don't see at all that governments have been taking the consequences of that out of that dramatically changing situation. Maybe I leave it at that. You raised a lot of other points, but maybe we can come back to that later.
Thank you, Michael. And now, Bruno, maybe you can do the synthesis between the military aspect and the civilian aspect, because you worked for an organization that is precisely mandated to promote civilian industry and prevent diversion of nuclear materials to so-called non-peaceful purposes. So do you agree with both speakers on the current threats in terms of nuclear weapons and nuclear terrorism?
It's a different topics. They are different topics, it's clear. First of all, I would like to take exception with your statement, Mark, that all nuclear weapons have started with civilian energy. First of all, uranium is produced, enriched uranium is not produced in a reactor, and it's already a good weapon material by itself. Plutonium needs to be produced, but it has always been produced in reactors that had been built to that intent. Sometimes used for both purposes, like the early French and British gas-cooled reactors. But basically, all nuclear weapon program is started with the will to go directly to as quickly as possible to the weapon. And the difficult situation, or at least the intriguing situation here, is that it's easier, in my view, to build a nuclear weapon than it is to operate a nuclear power plant of any given size. So that's why North Korea could come to explosive devices. That's how Israel came to nuclear weapon without having a power reactor at hand. It's true also of the Americans, obviously, who had special facilities for their military program. So by nature, plutonium has to be produced in a reactor, but it's a physical instrument, it's not a nuclear power plant. And in the other direction, there are very few examples. I could think, no, not even Iran, they started their power plant much later, and they were not under control. So that it's not true that nuclear weapon requires a physical, a civilian reactor. What it does require, and it's true for all weapons of mass destruction, it takes physicists and chemists and scientists. So one way to eliminate the connection is simply to stop education in all kinds of fields. But this is not exactly the easiest way. So that, let me comment first on what my neighbor, Mrs. Zelter, said, because I was very interested with what has been done by the Trident Plowshare movement in terms of being a ground-level movement. It started as a local issue around the Trident submarine in Scotland, and now a couple of years later, a week ago, we had an agreement at the United Nations on tackling the problem from the top, to have a broad agreement initially. For my generation of what I've experienced at the IEA, when I was the Deputy Director General of the IEA in charge of safeguards, the approach was always thought to be gradual. Let's start with minimum steps and go and hope that at the end there would be a major treaty banning, prohibiting nuclear weapons. And the frustration was there for a long time. Being mostly involved in the NPT myself, I could see the blatant arrogance of the weapon states to ignore Article 6 of the NPT, which did state that the weapon state had to make efforts towards dismantling their own program, which they didn't do. They were all eager to put an additional burden on all of the states to make sure they would not have too much a degree of freedom. But basically they did nothing. It was a standard part in the Director General's speech on the second paragraph to ask weapon state to abide by Article 6 and do something about it. In my case, I was more concerned about safeguard than about banning nuclear weapon. And then I had the privilege to come in this house and to come to the United Nations in the year 2007, as a consultant to the Swiss government, also as a consultant for the IEA at a point, which was, let's make a fissile material treaty a reality. So there were various events organized to explain to the delegation, to the member states, to the member of the Conference on Disarmament, because that's what it was. The focus was the Conference on Disarmament, with the hope something could start. Well, nothing could start, because first of all, there was obviously one country opposing any effort in the direction of controlling fissile material. It was Pakistan. But Pakistan was a very convenient shield for all the others, in the sense that weapon states in general were not interested, were not ready to move. They would say so, yes, let's have an FMCT. But in reality, everybody was very grateful to the Pakistani ambassador that he would stop the way to any real negotiation in the Conference on Disarmament. So nothing has happened. And there was a discussion in the Conference on Disarmament to move the whole topic to the United Nations. Because there in the General Assembly it is possible to work without the veto of either the permanent members of the Security Council or all members of the Conference on Disarmament for any decision which has to be taken. So that was very frustrating, and I must say I kind of lost interest a little bit in the last few years because it looks really hopeless. And of course I was very, very glad to read what has happened in New York, because here you have the beginning of discussion. Whether it will be successful at last is another matter, but it does bring the issue up to a level of consciousness, of awareness, that is better than what we had in the past. So I hope that the organization like the Trident Plowshare, you were part of this exercise, I think, with the international coalition, would move forward somewhere, maybe in Geneva, probably not in the Conference on Disarmament, but it should be in reality, that's where it should be. However, there is too much opposition, as we saw in New York, in the vote, where at the exception of one so-called weapon state who approved the resolution, North Korea, there was a major opposition. It was very regretful for once that many members of the European Union did try to please France by not, I don't think they were trying to please the United Kingdom, but maybe they were trying to please France in not voting for the resolution. I was disappointed that the Swiss government did not support the resolution and abstaining. Thanks God, Liechtenstein did approve of the treaty, so it was something. I was also pleased to see that the International Committee for the Red Cross did make a public statement in favor. The International Committee for the Red Cross was the first recipient of the first Nobel Prize on Peace, so that they were at least coherent, consistent with their own position on the role of weapon in war. So that's a very important development, I think. I hope it will move things in Geneva a bit, because otherwise there will be a need to support moving the big negotiation on the Prohibition Treaty or the FMCT, if it's still decided to do something about it, about these gradual steps that should have preceded the big negotiation, but now that will be a real exercise starting. I mentioned the IA because it's really my position here. I was 6 years at the IA and involved on the nuclear disarmament side, on the non-proliferation side, to be precise, and not much in energy. But the IA had, regarding plowshare, there was a very interesting plowshare at the IA in front of the board meeting. There was a real plowshare about that size, which has been made out of the 7 nuclear devices that South Africa had built. The IEA, the Department of Safeguards, where I was at the time, did the exercise of dismantling the South African weapon program, including taking care of the leftover devices. The nuclear material was taken out and all the metallic part was melted down and made into a plowshare, which is a symbol of the name, of course, of your organization. A sentence taken from the Bible. The IA was given the Nobel Prize for peace in 2005. What I was interested in the statement by the Norwegian Academy was that the IA has made contribution to nuclear non-proliferation. Yes, by the nature of the role which has been assigned to it, namely verifying the respect of the commitment made by states in not developing nuclear weapon. And also, the Nobel Committee in Oslo made the point that the work of the IA to standardize, to improve the world guidelines on safety of nuclear facility in going into the direction of more systematic and more consistent rules, because these rules were unsatisfactory when the so-called Convention on Nuclear Safety was signed already a long time ago, but it was lacking teeth, so that some strengthening was done in the safety standards, in the safety guidelines. However, not to a level that was satisfactory. Here, I must at least congratulate the Swiss government. The Swiss government in 2003 made a major effort to strengthen the safety measure, which has been deemed insufficient, clearly, by the Fukushima accident, which was an accident due to human neglect. What has not been done at top collective power was criminal. I've used that expression in the past, in ignoring basic safety standards. Then, as a follow-up, the Swiss government, I must say, supported there by the European Union and by other states, did propose stronger guidelines, stronger rule for safety. And unfortunately, it was not accepted. These rules were not accepted. Who were the opponent? Well, I must make the point, big disappointment is again to see the official Japan refuse this increase in safety, the same way that Japan has voted no now on this prohibition of nuclear weapon. Official Japan has a lot of difficulty in respecting either American wishes or others, instead of taking clear decisions, which will be its duty as a follow-up Hiroshima, of course, the use of weapon, and Fukushima. But not only Japan did not accept, America did not, the United States of America did not accept these strengthening measures, deeming them unnecessary. Russia did not accept, Iran did not accept also a strengthening of measures. So there was unfortunately a weakening here of the situation. As I mentioned, my own position is based basically on the IEA position, which is we need both. Any technology which can be used also as weapon of mass destruction, be it nuclear, chemical, or biological, cannot simply be put in a black and white box and say, because weapon applications are possible, therefore the civilian use has to be forbidden one way or the other. This has not been done for chemical weapon. What has been done is to develop, here in Geneva, in that case, an excellent chemical convention, a convention that not only forbid the use or the production, but also the holding of stocks. It required the destruction of all stockpiles of chemical weapon in all states, So this is the model for a nuclear agreement, and it has been done. It has been done. And so doing, nobody has requested the closing of all chemical factories in the United States or in Switzerland or elsewhere. The industry has to accept some measures of control, but research and production can continue for peaceful purposes. Biological weapon is the same. All three failed, nuclear, chemical, and biological, all have caused the death of about 200,000 people altogether. This has to be reminded. There is, of course, the nuclear weapon in Japan, but there are also the biological weapon used by Japan in China, just before the war and during the war, with the systematic application on troops and people of plague, cholera, and anthrax, and so on. So this has to be taken into account. Biological, chemical, it's well known. The first agreement on chemical weapon dates to 1865, roughly. It forbade the use of chemicals weapon in ammunition. So what the Germans did in April 1915 in Belgium, they released chemical gases carried by wind. So it was not a weapon. It just happened to be carried by wind. And then, as you know, chemical weapons were used during the First World War, interestingly, not during the Second. So this duality between military and civilian application exists in all kinds of fields. You can take fire being itself a double edge. Fire has been a great invention for mankind, allowing food to be cooked and so on. It was a protection against animals, but it was also very destructive, and it has to be contained in many places. So that this requires a discussion. I would not suggest maybe now, but there must be some nuances or some consideration. So because I believe, I would first stop my comments here on this first leg. I believe that nuclear energy can be used, but it has to be used very properly. It's a difficult technology. It's not for everybody in the world. It requires a strong infrastructure. It can be used in states which would build a relatively large number of plants so that they develop a capability. It could also be used in small states with a highly industrial basis, but it takes a lot. So therefore, nuclear is not a solution for the world. I would agree, which has not been said here yet, but elsewhere, that it's not by itself a major contribution to fighting climate change. It could be in states which have the nuclear capability. So nuclear states with nuclear power plants should keep them, because they can be a local contribution. And things have to be addressed on factual basis and not on ideological basis. On? Terrorism. Terrorism, I'm always amazed to hear 9/11 or thing like that. Terrorism has been around for a long time in nuclear planning. In Switzerland, where I know a little bit better what has happened, it started in It started in the 70s already because there had been attacks. A Swiss airplane was crashed by the Palestinians very close to a Swiss nuclear power plant. So it changed, of course, the perspective of airplane crashes. Terrorism on the ground had been used, of course, for a very long time. And terrorism has been also used as a weapon by Swiss green activists when they bought a couple of bazookas from a terrorist called Carlos, who is in jail in France. And they used, one guy here who was a civil servant here in Geneva, shot 7 bazookas to the French nuclear power plant in Cremerville, under construction at the time. The containment was still open, so it just went through. And he admitted to this act 2 weeks before we had an election in Switzerland in 2003, so that was very particular. And recently a professor at the Technical School of Technology said, would you deal with nuclear power plant? Well, I would blow one up. So, in other words, it has been done. A nuclear power plant is a bunker of very great efficiency. Nuclear airplane crashes have been considered, and a drone is an impossible weapon against a nuclear power plant when there are meters of concrete and steel in between. Drones can blow 10,000 people here in a football field. If you have 10 drones coming with little bombs, then they can do damage, but not on a nuclear power plant. Well, it's no point in getting into the detail. The whole point is that I think nuclear has its risk. And terrorism, to the large extent, is taking place, is taken care of. One can imagine all kinds of scenarios, but terrorists, since that's a key word, will not, in my view, will not be able to use nuclear weapons, for example, because a nuclear weapon still requires laboratories with maybe 100 or 200 people working there. And a terrorist group will not be able to develop a nuclear weapon unknown to the host states. That's a key difference. There will be a host state somewhere. A terrorist group is always somewhere. And unless, of course, you can say Syria is falling apart, therefore there are no government in charge. But whereas terrorists will are very likely to try once with radioactive material mixed with dynamite to scare people downtown Geneva or downtown New York. So terrorism is not an issue with nuclear power because radioactive materials are found in hospitals, in industry, in everywhere. So that it's a different ballgame.
Yes, please. I would expect some reaction.
Well, I think it's a pity because it's slightly misleading to suggest that basically a nuclear power plant has everywhere 2 meters of concrete and therefore it's inattackable. You know better than I do that the key problem we have in most of the nuclear power plants in the world are the spent fuel pools. It's not the hardened. I mean, if you want to attack a facility, you don't attack it by the strongest part, you attack it by the weakest part. And the big problem we have is that there is a huge radioactivity inventory in the spent fuel pools. And you know better than I do that most of the spent fuel pools are not inside the containment, unlike it is the case now. The German reactors that still operate have all their spent fuel pools inside the containment. So there, this is correct what you're saying in terms of direct attack. If you undermine electricity generation in a reactor, and you don't have to get inside for that, then we've seen what that can do to reactors. We have seen that in Fukushima. So to suggest because the containment has 2 meters that there would be no way for kind of an outside attack is, I think, highly misleading. And as I said, to me, the most sensitive facility is other facilities like La Hague, where you have non-hardened, and this is a matter, you see, this is not a matter of opinion. I think we can agree on this. The spent fuel pools at La Hague are non-hardened, full stop. It's not a matter whether you think that or I think that. the spent fuel pools are not hardened. And it's a huge, I think, it's a huge security issue. And I think that today we have different technical means, and we need to look at different attack scenarios, strategies, than we had to look at in the 1970s. The world has changed. So I think that is a very, very important part. When it comes to nuclear energy generation, I think we have to distinguish between a strategy that includes spent fuel reprocessing and a strategy that is called once through. So you know, which most of the countries in the world do. So they basically unload the fuel and put the fuel into the best they can do is in dry storage. As soon as they can take them out of the pools, that's the safest possibility, and it's also the most secure possibility to do so. The other strategy is the reprocessing route. So you ship the spent fuel to what they call a reprocessing plant, separate plutonium and uranium out, and then you try to, wherever possible, reuse that plutonium. And nuclear energy use is perfectly possible without reprocessing. And I think there should be a debate, including on the issues of the FMCT. You know, the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty debate so far has only included military-grade plutonium and not reactor-grade plutonium, which I think is a mistake. We have a situation today where the weapons countries, the large weapon countries, have not generated weapons-grade plutonium for over 20 years, or around, let's say, around 20 years. So it's a stable stock, which is a problem, of course, but it's stable. The stock of so-called reactor-grade plutonium, which is perfectly weapons usable, makes, you know, less reliable weapons, etc. I know all the discourse you can make on it, but it's weapons capable. This stock is increasing without any interruption for decades, and now it's over half of the world stock, and I think that has to be addressed. I've been therefore very much, how shall I say, I think that the whole approach to a fissile material cutoff treaty should include reactor-grade plutonium. If it doesn't, it's worthless.
Thank you. Precisely on this fissile material cutoff treaty, it's been presented over the years by the nuclear weapon states as the first step in the step-by-step approach to nuclear disarmament, the only realistic step to take at the moment, which, as we know, is not even been possible to agree on at the Conference on Disarmament. Now, the position of all the supporters of this treaty is that, at least from the nuclear weapon states, is that we should just confirm the current moratorium of production of fissile material for nuclear weapons, which, as you said, is a fact, perhaps with minor exceptions on the part of India and Pakistan. But at the same time, that would not entail any reductions on the existing stockpiles. And according to your own organization, the IPFM, the existing stockpiles of highly enriched uranium and weapons-grade plutonium could allow to produce between 120 to 150,000 more nuclear weapons. So that means that if we don't do anything about these existing stockpiles, fissile material cutoff treaty will not bring much progress. Do you all agree?
Yeah, but I have another issue, I think, about security as a whole. From ordinary people's perspective, nuclear power is not the answer to our energy needs. It doesn't help us create the energy we need in a clean and sustainable manner. But also nuclear power, especially in our country at the moment, has a problem which they've never been able to solve, which is waste. Where does the waste go? And why should we be trying to protect it for thousands and thousands of years? You plutonium wasn't even known on the planet before this whole thing happened. I mean, and it lasts for hundreds of thousands of years. That's an issue, a health issue. Cancer epidemics, we can argue about where that comes from, but in the opinion of many of us, the nuclear tests that were done, but also from the uranium mining and the spills and the accidents is one of the reasons why we're getting a cancer epidemic. From a human security point of view, we don't want nuclear power stations or nuclear weapons because they lead to a more secretive society, a more centralized society, and also it takes the power away from individual, more sustainable villages and towns to create their own decentralized power system. And the point is if you've got an enemy that's trying to destroy your way of life, it's very easy to take out centralized coal power stations or nuclear power stations. It's much harder if you've got a small micro hydro system or some windmills or solar systems or whatever. And we should be trying to give power back to ordinary people to build more sustainable, compassionate societies. And a centralized nuclear energy system does not do that. And we're discovering with the ridiculous decision to go ahead with Hinkley Power Station in the UK that there do seem to be links with the military. The military, nuclear industry is running out of trained technicians and they want a nuclear industry. Now you could argue how likely this is or not, but there seems to be no rational reason why Britain should be going for more nuclear power stations when it makes no sense economically or in a security point of view. So I think I would like to open the debate more to other people.
Maybe just before we start the Q&A session, just a reminder of the news that occurred last week. The International Energy Agency, not the IEA, but the IEA, announced that green energy or renewable energy accounted for more than half of net electricity generation capacity added around the world last year for the first time, and that this was evidence of rapid transformation in energy taking place, and predicted capacity for renewable resources will grow faster than oil, gas, coal, and nuclear power in the next 5 years. So do you agree that this is the likely development to occur and it's a positive development?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's very interesting that if you do the actual assessment of trends, and we do that with an annual report, which is called the World Nuclear Industry Status Report, which you can look up on the web. It's downloadable for free at worldnuclearreport.org. We've done this for a number of years, every year, to see, what reactors are started up, how many are shut down, how many are under construction, how long it takes, etc. So what we see is that it doesn't really matter whether you like it or you don't like it. What the empirical evidence is that it's going downhill, with one exception, that is China. China is building up incredibly quickly, which is, by the way, the speed itself is of great concern, not only from outside the country, but also from inside the country, because it's obviously a headache to build up skills and competence as fast as they are building these things. And just to give you an illustration, that last year in the whole world, 10 reactors were started up, and of those 10 reactors, 8 started up in China. Now, all of the nuclear power plants that have come online over the past 5 years have been started to be built before Fukushima was triggered in March 2011. So what we're seeing is not yet the Fukushima effect. It's still delayed. So, but if you look at construction starts, it's interesting to note that China, for example, that had ordered alone in 2010, 10 reactors. I started construction in for 10 reactors. In 2011, none. None. And in 2014, none. And all of them that have been actually started to be built in the meantime were already in the pipeline. So they were not part of that Fukushima effect. So what we're seeing is actually, you can call it an organic phase out of nuclear power. Like there's some countries that have limited the operational times, like Germany that has decided to phase out nuclear power. Belgium has limited to 40 years. Switzerland has actually also limited, but Switzerland has already the oldest nuclear fleet in the world. I mean, you have to imagine that they operate a nuclear reactor that is 47 years old. It's also the oldest reactor in the world. 47 years old. And the average operational time is over 41 years. Now, 41 years, I mean, think back. Do you remember what the cars looked like 40 years ago? I mean, we were in another technological age. These are really old plants. This is really old technology, and you can only upgrade so much in these facilities. So that is an increasing concern. Also, what we're seeing is that in countries that have built in the past very fast, Japan, South Korea, we have seen in both countries. In Japan, 10 years before, almost 10 years, in 2003, 2004, a huge scandal on quality control certificates falsification in Japan that led to the shutdown of all 17 TEPCO reactors at the time, basically without the world noticing. It was a Japanese story. And then we have Fukushima that as you say, it's a man-made disaster, as an inquiry committee found as well in Japan. And in Korea, in 2013, we see a very similar situation where thousands of pieces that were integrated in nuclear power plants had faked quality control certificates. And now, to me, the worst thing, I live in France. We just realized that by the safety agencies have found out that we have a huge problem of, they're very careful. They call it inaccuracies in the quality control certificates. But for the first time last week, the head of the safety authorities has used the term falsification. So even in a country like France, which honestly, I didn't think that was possible. But it led to the shutdown, even last week, of 5 additional reactors. So we have currently over a third of the reactor fleet in France that is shut down. So this is very serious and has very serious implications. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is one likes it or one doesn't like it. The trend is very clear. The trend is towards a decline. And as we've seen in the UK, that just authorized the building of a new nuclear power plant, 2 reactors at Hinkley Point, which is probably the largest investment project ever in any country in size. Whether it will be built in the end or not is another story. But it's interesting to see that in 2015, the UK has increased its renewable energy generation. This is reality. It's not a project. It's reality by 29%. And that's by coincidence, 29 billion kilowatt hours, 29 terawatt hours increase, the incremental increase in 1 year. And that is more that these Hinkley Point reactors are supposed to generate 10 years from now. So that illustrates also this is very fast. It's not only a cost issue, it's the time factor kicks in. And that's the real issue here. It's whatever you think about nuclear power is too costly and it's too slow. And the time factor is here kicking in massively.
Thank you very much for this first round. So now we can open the floor for questions and answers. Please identify yourselves and direct a question to a particular panelist. Yes, please.
So, thank you very much. My name is Patrick Nowak. I'm Executive Director of a small NGO in Geneva called Global Future. I was also Technology Foresight Manager at the CTBTO until not long ago. Thank you very much for these presentations. They give us a really nice snapshot of what's been happening and what is happening. And also it mentions all the various treaties and ongoing things that are being negotiated. But what I'm struggling to hear is from you, what does it take for the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons to actually pass globally? What does it take for the FMCT? What does it take for the NPT? What does it take? Is it societal change, like you have mentioned? Do we radically need to rethink the way societies work? And is then all the nuclear treaties that we want to achieve a byproduct of that? What does it take? I'd like you to think, what we do on a daily basis in our business at Global Future is to try to think about the future. We know the present, some of it is hidden away. We know the past, some of it. What does it take to make that future happen? Thank you.
It does require society to completely change. It does. We have to think of ourselves as global citizens on a planet where the life systems are being totally destroyed. The planet is dying. We can't go on as usual, which means that actually people have to take the power back from corporations, from the financial structures, from our governments, and actually start building up from the ground sustainable communities. And it's going to be very hard because most people feel very disempowered, very depressed, and I don't know whether we're going to succeed. So it's very difficult. But I think that we need to work with our families and our communities and actually start living in a compassionate and thoughtful manner. And we have to insist that our politicians change and take away the power from the corporations and the financial structures that are making everything commoditized and money-centered. Because basically we can't eat, drink, or breathe money. Now we know all of that, but we're not listening on the ground to the changes that really need to happen.
I would like to add a comment on this issue because, first of all, you know that the entire nuclear weapon community is very frequently also a peace community. Namely, there must be peace in the world, there should be no war, it should be forbidden. And this is, of course, an issue for some state. It may be an issue for the world as a whole. And what I want to inject here, maybe controversial for maybe, that in this discussion on prohibiting nuclear power, there should be one that says what I've been telling colleagues, member states, but you don't need them anymore because we have moved into a world of modern weapon technology, precision technology. You don't have to destroy a whole city in order to get to the military facility you want to get. Precision warfare, conventional fire bombs or whatever. So don't argue about the need to have nuclear weapon to survive, to keep at bay, to terrorists, for example, or whatever. No, there are the means. So I think the discussion on banning nuclear weapon would gain a bit if one would separate these two issues. Because some states have the feeling they have the responsibility for the safety of Europe or whatever against nuclear weapon. And at one time it was said, let's ban nuclear weapon, but let's put a few of them in the hands of the United Nations so that they would be a last recourse to protect against a rogue state, first class. No, I would say we don't need nuclear weapon at all. If I would be a military man, I would say we can do it. At least some of the states with the fantastic potential they have nowadays with modern technology, miniaturization of systems and so on, where you have smartphones end up in fighting submarine war, for example, because of the new technology. So let's separate the peace discussion from the banning nuclear weapon discussion.
if I may abuse my position also, just point shameless promotion to the draft paper I wrote and circulated on humanitarian disarmament, precisely trying to show that this new paradigm of human security is now gaining traction and is becoming a dominating factor, and that's the reason why it has, it was initiated. All these initiatives came from civil society organizations to ban anti-personnel landmines, cluster munitions, control the arms trade, and now ban nuclear weapons, because all these initiatives respond to the same criterion of protecting civilian populations. So if you can see if the international community could adopt this criterion, this paradigm, versus the traditional state security or national security paradigm, certainly that would make it easier to continue progress in this disarmament.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I wonder whether the question should be, what does it take to actually get these treaties signed than to get the objectives implemented? Because, I mean, as you've been mentioning the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I mean, look at the history of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I mean, it was, as soon as it was signed, the number of nuclear weapons in the world increased for what, 20 years, 30 years? So I mean, I think I'm more interested to see where can we make concrete steps in order to increase, and I like the term as such, human security. So to me, the debate about treaties is one path, but there's many others. And I think, when, for example, the recent debate triggered in the US on no first use, I think that's very useful. It's where this goes, I don't know, but I think it's very useful. And I think unilateral initiatives like that are very useful. If there was, for example, Japan stating that they will not open their commercial reprocessing facility, that they will immobilize their stock of plutonium, this would be a huge geopolitical sign. I think it would be incredibly powerful for the entire region. You don't necessarily need the treaty tool to really get steps underway to increase human security. Unfortunately, on the treaty side, I mean, we've actually had some very serious setbacks with the Russian cancellation of the fissile material management agreements, which I consider is a disaster. I mean, a real disaster.
I recognize Alan Ware, another laureate of the Alternative Nobel Prize.
Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon. My name's Alan Ware. I'm from New Zealand, and another of the Livelihood laureates, partly maybe because of the success, not just myself, but our movement had in New Zealand to ban nuclear weapons there. And I like to think of Livelihood laureates as examples of change makers, of people who have seen a situation, believe it can be changed, and then look at how to make that change. And I think some of these questions are relating to that, which is very good. And I've got a couple to follow up. I should also say we also prohibited nuclear energy in New Zealand, even before the renewable energies had become competitive in cost. And so now we see there's really no reason for making nuclear energy plants. We're surprised that some countries are still thinking of doing it, and we're thinking maybe there's other reasons because the reasons against it are just so compelling. But my questions are more on the nuclear weapons side, because I want to follow up on the couple of comments that we've made. One, Mr Pellaud mentioned that maybe the argument to make is that you don't need nuclear weapons because you have other weapons which can be used in military operations. But I don't think that that's a very compelling reason, because the nuclear weapon states are not really holding on to those nuclear weapons to use them in current military operations. They give a different reason for them. They say, we need them for deterrence, to deter another country from attacking. We're not really intending on using them. The problem, of course, is they have first-use policies. Some of them have them on high alert status, ready to be used in a conflict. launch on warning policies, Russia and the United States. So in times of tension, there's a real risk they could be used by accident or miscalculation. So I don't have the same confidence that the nuclear weapon states have that their nuclear weapons will prevent nuclear weapons use. I think it could actually be the opposite. But how do we move then if it's not really military operational? I think Marc was talking more along these lines. Are there other ways of thinking about security and achieving security without threatening to annihilate your neighbours and destroy the world? And that's where I think most of the world has actually said yes. The whole of the southern hemisphere is nuclear free. All of us down south have banned nuclear weapons. Also a number of countries in the northern hemisphere. So it's only a minority that still hold on to this crazy idea that you have security by threatening to annihilate others. But we have to try and convince them. And I think that's, we can do that by using the cooperative security ideas, international law, conflict resolution, how the United Nations can help countries resolve problems, and the OSCE. But the question I ask is, do you think that's enough? Will that convince the nuclear weapon states? Or are there other interests? And I think Angie referred to this. Is it the money? Is it that there are these new corporations making nuclear weapons like Lockheed Martin, who has 10 times the budget of the United Nations, and so they're making so much money they don't want to lose that money? If that's the case, do we need to have a slightly different strategy as well? Not just trying to persuade the governments at the United Nations, which they might say, oh yeah, sometime in the future we'll get to nuclear disarmament, but we actually have to hit the corporations. We've just put out a book on that called Move the Nuclear Money, which looks at ways you might be able to hit the nuclear corporations. And the question I have of the panel is this an important strategy? Divestment from nuclear weapons corporations, don't bank with banks that are investing in nuclear weapons corporations, and trying to address the budgets in the nuclear weapon states. Are these important strategies to get to a nuclear weapons-free world? Thank you.
Well, yes. Short answer, yes. We do have to shift the money away from the nuclear weapons. And the corporate power actually is an issue that we have to come to terms with on all sorts of different issues, actually. The other thing is that it's going to be very hard. I'm sure this treaty will be signed, and it's great. But for citizens in the nuclear weapon states that will not be signing it, we're going to need to have many more citizens resisting and trying to disrupt and stop and be involved in civil resistance and do what they can in order to shame the nuclear nations. And some of the initiatives on that level will be also trying to delegitimize the nuclear weapons under the national legal systems, not just the international legal systems. So, for instance, there's public interest cases happening in the UK, and I'm hoping that that might be a process that other countries, other nuclear nations, other citizens in the nuclear states will do through their legal systems as well. But obviously, taking the money away from the corporations, divestment's having a huge impact in all sorts of different issues and conflict areas.
Bring this panel to an end and express our satisfaction and gratitude to the panelists. And of course, there is still, if you're interested in private meetings, you still have some time. Thank you so much.